podcast. We're going to talk about learning how to describe your team and your league as accurately as possible and what it takes to win. And joining me to do that is the Director of Research and Analytics at the University of Akron, Rich Worsell. Rich, great to have you here on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So you guys will hear right away that Rich has a little bit of an accent, a dialect, and it's not from Alabama. It's from England. Rich was born and raised in England, and he's going to tell us a little bit about his story and how he got to the United States. But Rich, for you, this has been a different path than most of the guests that I talked to on the podcast. I want to say maybe other than one other coach, you're the first foreign-born coach that I've had on the podcast. But for you, where did this passion for football develop in the UK?
I mean, it's a crazy journey that I've led over the last 20, 30 years. So I was 10 or 11 years old, and all my friends come into school one day and are like, "Hey, we're playing American football. You want to come play?" And I'm like, "Yeah, great. What the heck is American football?" And we went along, and the local American coach had moved to the town and was coaching everybody up, and there was so much energy and enthusiasm. It was infectious, and I think it's one of those lightning in a bottle things. You just experience something at the right age, and you just become passionate about it. And a few years later, our team folded, and I was like 15, didn't have a place to play, so I talked my parents into us starting our own team, and we entered the National League, and we had a coach we hired for a season, and then after the season he left. Well, we still wanted to play, so did the only thing a rational 16-year-old could do and become the head coach. So played and coached and wrote playbooks in the offseason and recorded on VHS tapes the televised games that we'd get every Sunday, and had probably a collection of 100 videotapes with film on it that I would just sit there and watch and write plays down all offseason. And I guess that's kind of where my initial passion for film and football and everything came into, and then went to college in England and actually in Wales. Wanted to come to the States but couldn't figure out how to do it. But I graduated, was working for an investment company doing offshore brokering, which sounds way more exciting than it was. And came home one day and again spoke to my family and was like, I really want to coach football. It's what I love to do. I miss, spending as much time as I can on it when I'm at work. And they really encouraged me. So I started applying for jobs. And actually at that point, I had to fax my resume all over the place. So we had a fax machine at the house, and I was faxing resumes all across the U.S. and eventually got lucky with a GA spot at a D3 school in Wisconsin at Lakeland College, and went there in 2003 with the idea of, let's see this for 2 years, see how we go, and now I'm still here and call America home.
Well, I know one thing you mentioned to me, and if we could back it up a little bit, you definitely had an interest and aptitude for math as well. Both of your parents were educators, math teachers, and for a while it was that looked like something maybe you would do because you scored very highly in the math area. If you could talk to us about just that side of it and how much that plays into what you're doing today.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. Both parents were math teachers growing up. And so when we weren't in school, they were in there planning for lessons and stuff. I'd be in there trying to help and do different things, and I just assumed, hey, I'm going to be a math teacher like them. I finished A-levels and graduated in the top 2% in the country in mathematics, and had a pretty natural aptitude. My mom was really gifted at mathematics, and then went to college, and then realized that computer science, software engineering was really the application of mathematics, like computer programming and that aspect carried a lot of mathematics. So I ended up switching over to computing, and then wrote my dissertation on the real-time analysis of American football game, which was kind of, that's 2002. I'm writing code about breaking down games during a game. And then after I graduated, I actually got an opportunity to intern in NFL Europe And I'm up there in season, and I remember the coordinator and head coach trying to figure out how to do a self-scout. And I brought my laptop up and was like, well, I'll give it a go. And the next morning turned up with a whole self-scout, and those guys were kind of blown away by it. But it was kind of like my first foray into, like, professional kind of realm of it, really.
And when you look at that now, I mean, you were a Division III coach, and Division III schools don't have analytics departments. But, in talking to you before we got going, there was still an approach for you where you did look at kind of the data, the math, some of the things that you could be able to start to extract from watching film, from looking at breakdowns that have been an important part of this for every part of your career, all your stops along the way. Talk to us about your approach and how did that really become part of what you do, in all those different roles you've served in?
Yeah, to me, it started becoming more and more relevant to me when I was at the University of Laverne as the offensive coordinator. I started realizing, you start off and we're a multiple offense, so we can get in and out of most personnel groups and most formations within them. What formation should I be in? So I would start looking at our opponents to see which formations they allowed the most yardage, which plays were, which formations were the most efficient for their opponents, like, which, helped the ball move and get first downs. And that's where I would start the game plan often was, okay, these formations, they tend to struggle in. So then it was, leading the conversation for me is like, okay, I got to find what my top 2 or 3 formations are. And I'd start looking at those. And then within that, it's, what personnel do they struggle with? If they're giving up, 2 yards more per play in 11 personnel than 10 personnel, then why is that? What plays are they seeing differently? Or if it's the same plays, what personnel should I be in? Should I be in 2x2, 3x1? And sometimes it was contrary to what I kind of believed about a team was, I should be in 3x1 this game, but really mathematically it was coming out as I should be in 2x2 and make them defend both halves of the field. So that kind of really started guiding us. And I know any of the guys that played for me or coached for me at that point can attest that every Monday or Tuesday I'd pull out a 10-page stat packet that I'd been through, and every formation and everything had been number crunched to kind of give us the best odds to try and attack people. And I think there was a run in conference where essentially we'd get to halftime and figure out what our best formation was, and just live in that formation the entire second half. And we're playing Occidental. And I think we ran the same play out of the same formation. I think it was 22 plays in a row in the second half. And then a couple of weeks later, we're playing Redlands, and we got into the same formation, ran the same play, I think 23 times in a row. Now with it being RPO, the ball could go different spots, but you kind of were narrowing the focus all the time. And then in the game, you went in with a few different ideas of things that you felt were going to be good. And then mathematically, you just kind of followed them through into a formation you felt like they maybe had very limited answers to what you could do offensively, and you were already hopefully putting your guys in the best possible situation through plays, personnel, and formations. And that's all just based off the stats we would try and get from those guys, when we're game planning for them.
I think when you look at the heart of what analytics can do, and there was something important you mentioned in there, is it gives you a place to start to ask questions, that there still is, the human side of this that you need to look into. So while it may say, they're being hurt the most, maybe on this side of a formation, et cetera, you still have to look at and match some of your personnel with it. But I think, one of the things, as I mentioned in the beginning of this podcast, that, I wrote it down because you said it, and I think it accurately depicts what it is that it helps you describe your team in the league as accurately as possible and what it takes to win. And, I think we get caught in thinking we know all the right answers, but sometimes And I think when you can take an analytics approach, it maybe takes you out of the box of some of the common thinking. For example, and one thing we mentioned before we got going, thinking that you have to run plays to both sides of the formation. If you run the play right, you need to flip it over and be able to go to the left as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, going back to your first comment there, you're going to always be curious as a coach. You're watching film and you're going to have hunches of like, hey, I don't think they could stop this. Well, the analytics piece should be able to come in and support you there and say, no, they really struggle with that, or yes, they're really actually good at defending that. But on the flip side, it should give you as much questions as you get answers, and be like, hey, this formation with this play has cropped up in 4 different games and it's averaged 12 yards per attempt. Like, what is going on with that? Let's go in the film and look. So you should be answering questions with the the math, and then you should be creating questions you can kind of go back and look at the film and get answers to them. And when you're kind of doing that, that curiosity usually comes up with a pretty comprehensive view of your opponent. And then I think the math will enable you to kind of look at your own team, and see how they're doing, to look at your opponents, to compare different teams in your league to each other. And that's really what it's about. Is every league that I've coached in has had a different feeling. Some teams, like the Pac-12 is, for a while was pretty diverse offensively. You had Stanford, who were 2-back, and you had some other spread teams, but they looked very different than the Big Ten, who, Wisconsin and these sort of schools were going to be bigger personnel and try and run the football at you. So trying to understand the ins and outs of your league, what is effective in your league, what the top formations are, what the personnels are, statistically how you rank outside of just the things you get from the stat sheet, like how many first downs, like, how efficient your running game is compared to everybody else in the league. And then that helps you set a bar of like, okay, the top team in the league, was this percentage balanced, whereas you're this percentage balanced. So maybe you need to tweak things. After our 2014 season at Laverne, I remember we felt like we moved the ball really well all year. I think we were one of the top 20 teams or so in yards per game, but our points per game was not matching up for what I thought. So we went and looked, and what we found was our red zone touchdown percentage was significantly below everybody else. And so we had thrown, I think, 60% passes and 40% run in the red zone. And we looked at the top teams in the country, and they were the opposite of that. So in the 15 season, the idea was get the ball in the red zone and run it into the end zone. And all of a sudden in that league, we started doing that, and we finished first in the league in scoring, first in the league, rushing touchdowns, and we were first in the league in red zone because we just flipped that percentage based off the research we did the previous year. And instead of being an average team, we went undefeated that year. So that was a direct reflection of just looking at basic numbers the year before and making some subtle changes in play calling. And it kind of stemmed into our philosophy as well at that point.
Covering the second part of that, and just remind you here, you mentioned to me that idea of, kind of in the example you used, that you don't have to run a play to the right and then flip it over and run it to the left. You may only have a play that should be practiced and run a certain way. How have you been able to determine those types of things?
Yeah, I think, with your strengths as an offense, if your left tackle is your best player on the offensive line, and you're tracking your run game efficiencies, and you're seeing, hey, we're a couple of percentage higher, maybe we're averaging more yardage running it to the left than to the right, then when it's a critical situation, those 4 or 5, points during the game, it's a 4th and goal, it's a 3rd and 1, it's a 1st and 10, and you need to get a good play, then, push the needle in your favor and run the ball to the left behind your best guy. I mean, there would be plays that we would rep one way and not rep the other way because we knew we wouldn't call them the other direction. And I think you see it, even in the NFL now with the Dolphins when they went with Tua quarterback and they're running naked, but only to his left because he's a left-handed quarterback. They're not trying to make him run to the right and throw and get his hips around. So, that awareness of your offense, of your strengths and weaknesses, and then you try and match that, with your opponent. So if the other side of the ball is their weakness, then maybe some tackle unbalance comes into your game plan that week and you get your best blocker on their weaker side. And then you're, again, pushing the needle a couple percentage points in your favor in terms of converting in those situations. I think everyone is always afraid of, what if they know it's coming? Well, good teams have tendencies. I mean, everybody's played that team that was going to run a play and you knew it was coming and you couldn't stop it. Well, at some point it's got to come down to that. I don't think you can always, it used to drive me nuts at least, try and, they're expecting this and now I'm going to run this other play that we're not as good at because I think it's going to be better than the play that we are really good at. And I never had much success with that, but I think knowing your strengths, knowing their weaknesses and then matching them up wherever you can with directional play calls, it just makes sense to me.
And just watching games and observing, I'm seeing, I can definitely tell some teams that use analytics to determine what they're going to do in certain situations, to determine what their mode of attack is going to be. I know, looking back on this, and you and I are in Northeast Ohio this past NFL season and watching the Browns in several games, you could tell there was a point where they made a determination that we can play a very, very conservative game plan right now, not throw the ball down the field or do anything, from a perspective where it would be, risky ball handling, etc. And, we may not make fans happy, but we're going to end up winning this game because of the point differential and the time left on the clock. That we may only, we may be up by 4 touchdowns now, but we know at the very worst we're going to win by 3 or something like that, right? And I've seen that, Browns as an example. A lot of the teams now that you'll see, farther out than normal distance, going for it on 4th down, the go for 2 decisions, and even it came up twice in a single weekend. I had very rarely seen it, but the decision to give up a touchdown late in the game to be able to get the ball back, and I think it was Indiana won the game doing that, and then on Sunday, I believe it was the Detroit Lions, I think, were the ones who ended up, it paid off for them, but, both teams gave up touchdowns. So you see now more and more people paying attention to analytics. So there's a lot, right? When we look at this, it can get overwhelming. What recommendations do you have in being able to get started with this, regardless of what level you're at, to be able to make that impact on your program?
Yeah, I think when you're first starting with it, you want to try and be able to measure your team's success. You want to try and measure your other team's weakness, your opponent's weakness. And then, that aside, which helps you game plan, the bigger picture stuff that you can work on in the off season is like, looking at the 2-point chart in detail and really exploring that. There's some unique ones that happen. So like you're trailing 14 points, for example, and you score a touchdown. So now you're trailing 8 points. Well, most 2-point charts say kick the PAT and then continue to play and score and kick it again. And you're tying the game. But in reality, if you try and go for 2 there and you're successful, now you can score a touchdown and kick a PAT and win the game. And if you're unsuccessful, then you go for 2 again at the end of the game to tie it and take it into overtime or whatever. But, I think you can have a discussion and do the math in the off season when you have time to really talk about situations like that. Like, like you were talking about earlier, like if you're leading on someone by 28 points and it's, 4 possessions and there's 6 minutes left in the game, the odds are, even if you give up touchdowns really quickly, there's probably not enough time for them to score 4 touchdowns. Now, I'm sure somebody out there has scored 4 touchdowns in 6 minutes. It's happened less than 1% of times. But, playing the odds the majority of the time, you're going to walk out of there with a win. So it's anything that you kind of make assumptions about, it's going back and revisiting why did you make those assumptions and trying to understand, all the aspects that go in and out of making those decisions. Going for it on 4th down, like, some schools have all these different charts and different things, but you can have a consistent chart the whole year through and just be able to make decisions every week that are consistent about where is it on the field we're going to go for on 4th down. What's the distance we feel comfortable about? And those basic things in those different areas will kind of make a big difference for you in terms of making critical decisions and having given a lot of thought to those. And then, the other part of it we touched on earlier, just understanding your strengths and your weaknesses so as your play callers can put your kids in the best positions to play to their strengths.
So at this time of the year, I know you guys are going into spring ball, but the off season, in looking at your team's strengths and trying to help from your perspective, the offensive staff, let's say, put together their playbook, their menu of plays that they're going to choose from. How much do you get involved in that in the off season? And again, what are some of the applications that teams could do right now to get started with something like this?
Yeah, it's pretty fortunate being at a Division I school to have a really good offensive and defensive staff. So I try to not make it my position to go in and tell them what plays or what they should be running. That's their job. But what I do try and do is find situations that maybe we don't practice enough that we could dedicate more time to practicing, and the benefit of them would be this, that, if we have one more yard in these situations, I think it will equate to more points because of this. So we tend to talk a lot more about situational stuff. Like today, for example, we're working a spreadsheet based off of the MAC averages. How many snaps of every situation should we run in spring ball? So it's like, do we have too many 1st and 10 play calls? Do we have too few 2nd and long play calls? What do the MAC averages look like? How do we line up relative to those? So trying to put those numbers together helps us in spring ball. It helps us in fall camp, ensuring that we've really repped every situation that could happen and that we've given thought to those situations and that we've been in them and run them with our players so they're not kind of, caught off guard by those situations. And that's where the pure numbers help you align is like, are we a typical team in terms of our averages, or are we, different than the MAC? Is the MAC different this way or that way? And again, for me, it's all about understanding the MAC and the league you're in. I think with most teams having huddle, when you finish with an opponent, you can export the data into a spreadsheet. So you have access to that in the off season, and you can go in and look and be like, how many 1st and 10 plays does this other team that we aspire to be, average a game? How many 2nd and short and medium and long? And pretty quickly with Excel, you can start calculating that stuff. And then it helps you working back and scripting and planning all that stuff. You may have 100 ways to run your base run, but, you may not have that many snaps to run it when you kind of crunch the numbers backwards. So that's where I kind of try and fit in. When we do scout reports in season, if I see formations or personnel that I think are good, then often I kind of try and, point that out if it's something really obvious. But that's usually where our coaches kind of can start with the game planning, is looking at those formations and personnel first and then kind of going on from there.
So for you as a guy, whether it's been in a particular role like you are in now or having been, offensive coordinator before, in crunching the numbers, what's something that's come up in your career that you were surprised to find, whether that was a particular year or maybe something generalized across football?
Oh, good one. I'm trying to think. All right, it's just weird. Sometimes you kind of have feelings about stuff, but one of the things we've been talking about recently is, your first play of a drive, if it's above 5 yards, the percentage of times you score on that drive is something like 60%. But if it's below 5 yards, you're scoring maybe 30% of the time. So that just first play of the drive is so important to get you off and going. And I don't think, as a play caller in the past, I ever really thought about what 14 plays I wanted to open my drives, 13 plays I needed to open the drives. But it seems to be such a, relevance across the board for teams that, that first play of a drive is hugely impactful on the whole success of the drive. So, therefore I would be, trying to make everybody, hey, have a plan for the first half, your 7 best plays that you want to open drives with. And then at halftime, if you get nothing else done after your adjustments, then sit down and think of the plays you want to open your next drives with. Then I think that would pay dividends for you, because it, puts you in second and convertible, or you have a first down. Just keep stuff for that situation. So that kind of surprised me, even 20 years in, just, you crunch the numbers and you start looking at these things, you're like, wow, that's really different than I anticipated.
Yeah, that's a significant difference when you talk about, doubling the chance of scoring in a particular drive. That, and I could think back to when we started to be more defined about, how we're going to open drives, et cetera, and a lot of planning, always planning between series. But, I think being very intentional about spending time putting that together on your call sheet, that a lot of guys like to call it P10 or possession in 10, but those drive openers, rather than just our first down plays, making that distinction on your call sheet and really understanding that probably is something that a lot of people can do better. I know, looking back on it, I definitely could have been better at that.
Yeah, I mean, I dread to think now, if I went back and looked at my LeBron tapes, what my plays were like there. I bet the games we played pretty well, they were a good selection of plays, and the games we struggled, maybe it wasn't. So it's things like that. The more you can be educated about things like that, and especially then you're playing teams and you're like, man, if this first play of a drive is good, they're going to score 70% of the time. But if we can stone them here, it goes down to 20%, say, like you get a team that's really extreme, then that becomes a huge part of your game plan that week, just understanding that one statistic that you'd kind of calculated. And so that kind of surprised me, and it's something we're still continuing to look at. Like, then the questions become, what are the best plays to run to open a drive, like in all of football? So now you're trying to take a collection of teams and look at their plays and see what it is they do.
Coach, when you look at your aspect of getting the job done, what are some of your favorite tools or pieces of technology or things you would recommend to guys out there looking to get more into the analytics side of things?
Well, I think the stuff that most people have access to is probably the simplest, like Microsoft Excel and Microsoft Access, or any spreadsheet that you have, or any kind of database. The amount of power those things have is pretty significant with grouping and cross-tabbing and filtering and gathering different data points. I mean, that's inevitably every time something we're working on, we're going to take the data out of our video system and put it into a spreadsheet and start messing around with it a little bit, try and find things that are significant that then you can go back and make cut-ups of and study afterwards. So I think if you've never used Excel, going on there and copying a game out of Huddle or whatever system you use, putting it in there and being like, okay, let's grade every play, efficient or inefficient, based on how many yards it got towards the first down, and start filtering it. Okay, let's see 1st and 10. Let's look at P and 10. and pretty quickly you can start getting a good picture of your opponent and your own team as well. So I think those are really powerful. And then I know in Huddle, at least when I used it last, the reports feature can do some of those aspects. If you make columns that can kind of aid you in putting data in.
Coach, I know we've spent a lot of time talking about the data side of this, the analytics side, the numbers, but when you look back at your career and everything you've done as a coach, and you did have a lot of success in your time as a coordinator, what's the one thing you'd point to, the thing you do as a coach that really gives your guys the winning edge?
I think it's to an extent, as a coach, you're a salesman, and not like a car salesman sense, but you're trying to sell them the idea that your vision for offensively or defensively, what you're trying to do, gives them the best chance to win. And whatever game plan it is you're trying to put in, or whatever is day one install, you want to really sell them on why those things are unstoppable if you execute them. And so I think when you can do that and you can get your guys to play really hard, and I think I've had a lot of players through the years and they've played really hard for us. That 2015 Laverne team had the smallest offensive line in our league. Yeah, we led the league in rushing that year and about every different category on offense. I just think when you can sell them and they all believe in it, then they'll play really hard for you. And when you show them you care, and that's kind of the whole thing, really.
Coach, what's the best way for coaches who are listening to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm on both. Coaches can connect. I'm open, so if they want to email me or DM me on Twitter or hit me up on Facebook, then I usually kind of give my phone number out and people start calling me. So happy to do anything.
Coach, what's your Twitter handle?
It's @Coach_Worsell, WORSELL.
Coach, I really appreciate you taking the time and talking about analytics and research and some of the other things that popped up here in this conversation. Best of luck to you and University of Akron in 2021.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you again for listening to the Coaching Coordinator Podcast. Please, if you are enjoying the podcast, head over to iTunes or Spotify and click 5-star for rate. If you have a minute, write a review. It really helps the podcast. Check out our new home for the Coaching Coordinator Podcast. That's at coachandcoordinator.com. And follow me on Twitter @Coach K. Grabowski.